In the 1970s, South Korea was transforming itself. The Park Chung-hee government was driving an industrial revolution from the top down. Factories, highways, export zones. The deliberate construction of a modern economy from a country that had been devastated by war 20 years earlier. The cities were growing. The countryside was being left behind. In the villages and rural communities of that countryside, people lived close to each other and far from everything else. There were no highways connecting them to the cities in any meaningful time. There were no national television networks reaching every home. There was, in many places, very little of what a modern state provides, and very little of what a modern state notices. Into that landscape in 1975 came Kim Dae-du. Over the following year, he killed at least 12 people across the rural regions of South Chungcheong and North Jeolla Province. South Korea had no framework for what he was. The word serial killer did not exist in Korean criminal vocabulary. It would have to be invented. Kim Dae-du was born in 1946 in South Korea. He had grown up in poverty in the rural south of the country, the kind of grinding generational poverty that the Park Chung-hee era's economic miracle was beginning to address in the cities, but had not yet reached in the villages. He had little formal education. He had worked various manual labor jobs. He had a criminal record for theft and assault that predated the murders. In 1975, he began killing. The victims were people he encountered in the rural landscapes of South Chungcheong and North Jeolla Province. Farmers working in fields, travelers on rural roads, people in isolated farmhouses. They were not selected for any relationship to Kim, any perceived slight, any financial motive that investigators could clearly establish. They were selected as far as the evidence indicated for availability and isolation. He killed with whatever was at hand. Agricultural tools, blunt instruments, his hands. The attacks were sudden and violent. He did not linger. He moved on. Between 1975 and 1976, at least 12 people died. The actual number may be higher. In the rural communities of 1970s South Korea, not every death was investigated with the resources or the urgency that would later become standard. Some deaths that might today be connected to Kim Dae-du were likely recorded as accidents or causes unknown. What investigators eventually confirmed were 12 murders across multiple counties, a geographic spread that, in an era before computerized case management and interagency communication, made pattern recognition extraordinarily difficult. Each county saw its own isolated tragedy. No one, for a long time, saw the line connecting them. To understand why Kim Dae-du was not caught sooner, it is necessary to understand the South Korea of 1975. The country was under authoritarian rule. The KCIA, the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, was the dominant security apparatus, focused primarily on political dissent and the suppression of opposition to the Park government. Local police were under-resourced, under-trained in investigative methodology, and operating in a political environment where the priorities of the state were not primarily the safety of rural villagers. Forensic science as it is practiced today did not exist. There was no DNA analysis. There was no national criminal database. There was no criminal profiling discipline. There was no language, clinical, administrative, or journalistic for what Kim Dae-du was doing, because the concept had not yet been systematically defined in Korean law enforcement culture. A man killing strangers across a rural landscape for no discernible reason was, in the framework available to 1975 Korean investigators, simply a man doing terrible things. The framework for understanding him as something more specific, a predator with a pattern, operating systematically, requiring a systematic response, did not yet exist. It would be built in part from what his case required. The investigation into the killings that would eventually be attributed to Kim Dae-du was fragmented across multiple local jurisdictions for most of its duration. Local police in the affected counties of South Chungcheong and North Jeolla Province were aware of violent deaths in their areas. They investigated each incident with the resources available. They pursued leads that went nowhere. They interviewed residents, examined scenes, filed reports. What they did not do, because the systems to do it did not exist, was aggregate their findings into a single investigative picture that would have revealed the pattern connecting the deaths across county lines. The break came not from investigative analysis, but from the accumulated weight of witness accounts. Residents of the affected communities had seen a man. Descriptions that were consistent enough across separate encounters to suggest the same person. A man of a certain build, moving through the rural landscape on foot or by bicycle, appearing in areas where deaths had subsequently occurred. In 1976, a witness identified Kim Dae-du by name. He was located and arrested. The confession that followed was extensive. Kim Dae-du admitted to the killings with a directness that investigators found both useful and deeply unsettling. He provided details that confirmed his presence at scenes. He described his victims and his methods, without the hesitation that guilt typically produces. He was not, by the accounts of the investigators who interviewed him, a man who experienced what he had done as wrong in the way that the law and the society around him defined wrong. He experienced it as something he had done. The distinction was not lost on the investigators. It was also not something that the Korean criminal justice system of 1976 had a developed language for processing. The arrest of Kim Dae-du generated significant public attention in South Korea. This was not primarily because of the scale of the killings, though 12 murders was extraordinary. It was because of what the killings represented, a new category of criminal that the country's law enforcement and judicial systems were not designed to handle. Korean journalists covering the case reached for foreign terminology to describe what Kim was, importing the concept of the serial killer from American criminology, where the term had been formalized only a few years earlier, and applying it to a Korean context for what was effectively the first time. The coverage was extensive and, by the standards of the era, sensationalized. Kim Dae-du became a household name. His case was discussed in ways that reflected the country's attempt to process something that had no established place in its understanding of crime and criminals. The legal system processed him in the only way available to it. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed in 1977. He was 31 years old. Kim Dae-du did not change South Korean law enforcement overnight. No single case does. Institutional change moves slowly, through bureaucratic processes and budget cycles, and the gradual accumulation of evidence that a different approach is needed. But the Kim Dae-du case planted a seed. The questions his case forced Korean investigators to confront: How do you investigate a killer with no connection to his victims? How do you connect crimes across jurisdictional boundaries? How do you build a profile of a perpetrator from pattern rather than relationship? Were questions that the Korean criminal justice system would spend the following decades developing answers to. Those answers were incomplete in 1986, when the Hwaseong murders began. The investigation that followed, the largest in South Korean history, 180,000 officers, 21,000 suspects investigated. The killer not caught for 33 years demonstrated how far the system still had to go. They were more complete in 2004, when Yoo Young-chul killed 21 people in Seoul, and the behavioral analysis unit that had been established in the interim was deployed. Too late to prevent the killings, but deployed nonetheless. Evidence that the concept had been institutionalized. They were more complete still in 2008, when Kang Ho-soon's pattern across Gyeonggi province was identified through a coordinated provincial review that would not have been possible in 1976. The line from Kim Dae-du to the modern Korean criminal justice system is not straight. It bends through failures and reforms and tragedies that each added something to a framework that did not exist when he committed his first murder. He did not build that framework. His victims did. Their deaths made the questions unavoidable. The answers, imperfect as they remain, exist because those questions were finally asked. Kim Dae-du was not the worst serial killer in South Korean history. That designation belongs to others. To Lee Chun-jae, whose confirmed victim count exceeds 20, or to Yoo Young-chul, whose crimes spanned categories and whose confession detailed a psychology that criminologists still study. But Kim Dae-du was first. He was the first person in South Korean history to be identified, tried, and executed as what we would today call a serial killer. His case was the first time the country's media, its courts, its law enforcement apparatus, and its public were forced to confront the existence of a specific kind of criminal, one who kills strangers repeatedly across a landscape for reasons that defy the ordinary categories of motive and relationship. The 12 people he killed in 1975 and 1976 were not the victims of a family dispute or a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. They were the victims of something that South Korea did not yet have a word for. Their deaths gave the country a reason to find the words. The words were found. The frameworks were built. The systems were reformed. Slowly, incompletely, across decades of failures that each cost more lives. The process is not finished. It was never going to be finished. It started in South Korea with 12 people who encountered a man on the roads and paths of a rural province in 1975 and did not survive the encounter. Their names are known. They are the first.